Rome trained him to kill. They taught him their tactics. They showed him their weaknesses. Then they were shocked when he used all of it against them. The greatest slave rebellion in history succeeded because Rome created its own enemy, one arena fight at a time. A Thracian warrior named Spartacus went from being human property, forced to die for entertainment, to commanding over 100,000 warriors who brought the Roman Republic to its knees. He defeated legion after legion, using the very combat knowledge Rome had drilled into him in the gladiatorial schools. But here's the question that historians still debate 2,000 years later. How did a man with no formal authority, no treasury, no political connections unite 100,000 people from different tribes who spoke different languages into a coordinated military force that Rome's greatest generals struggled to defeat? Keep watching, because the answer reveals something profound about leadership, power, and what it really takes to challenge an empire that considers you less than human. Let me take you back to 73 BCE, to a place where human beings were transformed into weapons for the amusement of crowds. The gladiatorial school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua, south of Rome, wasn't just a prison. It was a factory that turned men into killers, a place where the Roman obsession with blood sport met the brutal economics of slavery, and Spartacus was trapped inside it. We don't know exactly when he was born, probably around 111 BCE, but we know he came from Thrace, a region in what's now southeastern Europe. He was a member of the Mede tribe, and here's something that makes his story even more tragic. He'd actually served in the Roman army. He knew their formations. He understood their discipline. He'd fought alongside them, but at some point, for reasons lost to history, he deserted. Maybe he saw something that broke his loyalty. Maybe he refused an order. We'll never know. What we do know is that the Romans captured him, and desertion from the legions carried one punishment: enslavement. They sold him like livestock. Him and his wife, who was a prophetess among the Mede people. Think about that for a second. A warrior who'd proven himself in Roman ranks, a woman with spiritual authority in her community, both reduced to property. The Romans who captured him earned his scorn, according to the ancient historian Plutarch, but scorn doesn't stop chains. They were separated, sold into different parts of the vast Roman slave trade, and Spartacus ended up in the hands of Quintus Lentulus Batiatus, who ran one of the most notorious gladiatorial schools in the empire. The ludus in Capua was hell with a training schedule. Batiatus packed it mostly with Gauls and Thracians, men from warrior cultures, men who knew how to fight, but now had to learn how to die with style, because that's what gladiators were, performers in Rome's most popular blood sport. The crowds didn't just want death, they wanted spectacle. They wanted to see men fight with skill and courage before they fell. The conditions inside that school would break most people. You woke before dawn to the sound of guards shouting commands. The first hour was always the same, exercises designed to build the specific muscles you'd need in the arena. Squats with heavy stones to strengthen your legs for the constant footwork of combat. Arm raises with weighted wooden swords until your shoulders burned and your grip failed. Core work that left you gasping, because a strong core meant you could twist and dodge and survive an extra few seconds when the crowd was screaming for blood. Then came weapons training. The Romans had turned killing into a science, and the gladiatorial schools were their laboratories. You trained with the rudis first, a wooden practice sword heavier than the real thing. The weight built strength and endurance. When you could move fast with the wooden sword, the real gladius felt light, responsive, deadly. The trainers, called doctors, were former gladiators who'd won their freedom. They knew every technique because they'd used every technique to survive. They taught you how to read an opponent's eyes, how to feint left and strike right, how to use your shield, not just for defense, but as a weapon to bash and disorient. You learned the different fighting styles. The murmillo, heavily armored with a large rectangular shield and short sword, designed to wear down opponents with defensive patience. The Thraex, Spartacus's style, lighter armor but more mobile, using a smaller shield and a curved sickle sword that could hook around an opponent's defense. The Retiarius with his net and trident, relying on distance and entanglement. Each style had strengths and weaknesses, and you studied them all because you never knew who you'd face in the arena. The diet was calculated torture. Enough food to keep you alive and functional, but never enough to feel satisfied. Barley porridge in the morning, thick and bland, beans at midday, sometimes with a bit of meat if you were lucky, more porridge at night. 2. The trainers knew exactly how many calories you needed to train hard, but stay lean. Fat gladiators died quickly. Hungry gladiators stayed weak enough that rebellion seemed impossible. You lived in a state of constant, gnawing hunger that made it hard to think about anything except the next meal. The discipline was brutal and arbitrary. Guards could beat you for moving too slowly, for looking at them wrong, for any reason or no reason at all. You slept in cells barely large enough to lie down, sometimes chained to prevent escape attempts during the night. The message was clear. You weren't human. You were property that happened to breathe and bleed and die for entertainment. But here's what the Romans didn't understand about Spartacus. Every drill they forced him through was teaching him how their military worked. When the doctors demonstrated formation fighting, showing how gladiators could work together for special arena spectacles, Spartacus was learning how Roman legionaries coordinated in battle. When they taught him to read an opponent's stance and weight distribution, he was learning how to spot weaknesses in Roman defensive lines. When they drilled him on endurance and pain tolerance, they were creating someone who could push through exhaustion when battles lasted hours. The Romans thought they were breaking him. They thought the constant training was turning him into an obedient killer. Instead, they were giving him an education in exactly how to destroy them. Every formation drill was a lesson in Roman tactics. Every weapon session was practice with the tools he'd eventually use against his trainers. Every moment of forced discipline was teaching him how to impose discipline on others. The Ludus wasn't just a prison, it was a military academy, and Spartacus was an exceptional student. He watched everything. When Roman soldiers passed through Capua, he studied their gear, their formations, the way officers commanded and soldiers obeyed. When gladiatorial games featured mock battles with military themes, he memorized the tactics on display. When guards got drunk and talked carelessly, he listened to their complaints about legion life, about how centurions maintained control, about the weaknesses in Roman military structure that only insiders knew. And he wasn't alone in his rage. The Ludus held about 200 gladiators, and by early 73 BCE, they'd all had enough. Spartacus found allies among the other Thracians and the Gauls, men who understood what it meant to be conquered, to be reduced from warriors to entertainment. They started plotting, whispered conversations in the training yard, careful and coded, passed messages during meals, using gestures that looked casual but carried meaning. They were planning something that seemed impossible, a mass escape from one of the most secure facilities in the Roman world. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. They'd seize weapons during a training session, overwhelm the guards before an alarm could be raised, and fight their way out into the streets of Capua. From there, they'd scatter into the countryside before Roman forces could organize a pursuit. It was desperate, probably suicidal, but it was better than dying slowly in the arena for the amusement of people who saw you as less than human. But someone talked. Someone always talks. Maybe torture broke them. Maybe they hoped for better treatment by betraying the plot. Maybe they just cracked under the pressure. The guards discovered the conspiracy before it could unfold, and they moved to crush it before it started. They began rounding up the suspected ringleaders, preparing to make examples that would terrify the rest into submission. Out of 200 conspirators, only about 70 to 74 men managed to act fast enough to break free, And here's the detail that should make you smile. They didn't have weapons. The guards had locked down the armory the moment they suspected trouble. So these 70 warriors, these men trained to kill with swords and spears and shields, they grabbed whatever they could from the kitchens: cooking knives, meat cleavers, skewers, tools meant for preparing food, now wielded as weapons of liberation. Think about the audacity of that moment. 70 men with kitchen knives, fighting through trained guards who had real weapons, bursting into the streets of Capua in broad daylight. They could have been slaughtered in minutes. The guards outnumbered them. The guards had proper weapons and armor. But these weren't just desperate slaves. These were warriors who'd been forced to master combat, who'd trained every day for years, who knew how to kill efficiently even with improvised weapons. They used their bodies as weapons, their training as advantage. They grappled and struck and moved with coordinated violence that overwhelmed guards who'd gotten lazy and comfortable. And as they fought their way through the city, they spotted something that changed everything: a caravan of weapons and armor meant for upcoming gladiatorial games. Swords, shields, helmets, greaves, everything a fighter needed. They seized it in a lightning raid, and suddenly men armed with kitchen utensils were wielding real gladii, real scooter, real military equipment. The transformation happened in minutes, from slaves with cooking knives to armed warriors with proper gear. They ran for Mount Vesuvius, the volcanic mountain that loomed over the region. That choice, that decision to claim the high ground instead of just scattering into the countryside, that's when Spartacus transformed from a fugitive into a strategist. Someone made the call to regroup at a defensible position. Someone understood that staying together and organized gave them better odds than splitting up and running. The ancient sources don't tell us exactly who made that decision, but the tactical sophistication suggests Spartacus's military background was already shaping the rebellion. They made it to the crater at the top of Vesuvius and set up a defensive position. The volcanic crater provided natural fortifications, steep slopes that attackers would have to climb, limited approaches that could be defended by small numbers, and a vantage point that let them see Roman forces coming from miles away. They posted sentries, organized watches, rationed the supplies they'd grabbed during the escape. These weren't panicked runaways hiding in the wilderness. These were soldiers establishing a base of operations. The Roman response was predictably arrogant. The Senate sent a commander named Gaius Claudius Glaber with a force of militia, not even regular legionaries, because how seriously do you need to take escaped slaves? These weren't the elite troops Rome sent against foreign enemies. These were local militia, farmers and shopkeepers pressed into temporary service, given basic equipment, and told to go deal with some runaways on a mountain. Glaber saw the situation and made what seemed like a smart, tactical decision. The rebels were trapped on top of a mountain with only one path down, a narrow trail that could be easily blocked. He positioned his forces at the base of that trail and settled in for a siege. No risk, no casualties, just wait for hunger and thirst to do the work. In a few days, maybe a week, the escaped gladiators would be desperate enough to surrender or weak enough to be easily killed when they tried to fight their way down. It was exactly the kind of thinking that Spartacus had learned to exploit during his time in the Roman army. Roman commanders often relied on conventional tactics, on doing what the manual said, on following established procedures. They were good at it, and it worked most of the time. But it made them predictable, and predictable enemies can be beaten if you're willing to do the unexpected. Spartacus looked at the situation and saw what Glaber couldn't imagine. The Romans expected a desperate frontal assault down that single path, a suicidal charge that would be cut down by militia holding the high ground of the trail. So he did something they never anticipated. He and his men wove ropes from wild vines growing on the mountainside, strong vines, thick enough to hold a man's weight, braided together for extra strength. They anchored the ropes at the crater rim and rappelled down the sheer cliff face on the opposite side of the mountain, the side Glaber had left unguarded because he thought it was impassable. Imagine being one of those 70 men. You're lowering yourself down a volcanic cliff in the dark, trusting your life to ropes made from vines, knowing that if the rope breaks or the anchor fails, you'll fall hundreds of feet to your death. But you do it anyway because staying means slow death by starvation, and charging down the trail means quick death by Roman swords. So you take the third option, the impossible option, the one your enemy can't imagine you'd try. They made it down, all of them. They circled around through the darkness, moving quietly through terrain they'd scouted from above, and they hit Glaber's camp from behind, from the direction he'd never thought to defend. The militia weren't expecting an attack. They were sitting around fires, eating their rations, maybe joking about the stupid slaves trapped on the mountain. Then suddenly there were armed men among them, striking from the shadows, and everything was chaos and screaming and blood. Glaber's force was destroyed completely. Some were killed in the initial assault, others fled into the darkness and were hunted down. The survivors scattered across the countryside, spreading word of what had happened. Birds. And Spartacus's band seized everything: weapons, armor, food, supplies, equipment. They'd started the fight with kitchen knives. Now they had military gear taken from a Roman force they'd outsmarted and annihilated. Rome had just learned that these weren't panicked runaways. These were warriors, led by someone who understood Roman tactics better than Roman commanders did, and word of that victory spread like wildfire through the slave population of southern Italy. Here's what you need to understand about Roman slavery in 73 BCE. It wasn't a small system, it was the engine of the entire economy. Rome had been conquering territories for centuries, and every conquest brought floods of prisoners who were sold into slavery. Gauls, Germans, Greeks, Africans, people from every corner of the Mediterranean world. They worked the fields that fed Rome. They built the roads and aqueducts. They served in wealthy homes. They labored in mines and quarries. They were everywhere, and they vastly outnumbered free citizens in many regions. Most of them lived in constant, grinding desperation. You worked from dawn until dark, doing back-breaking labor. You ate the cheapest food your master could provide. You slept in cramped quarters with dozens of others. You owned nothing, not even yourself. Your children, if you had them, were property too. You could be sold at any moment, separated from everyone you loved, sent to a new master in a distant region. You could be beaten or killed for any reason or no reason at all, and there was no law to protect you, no authority to appeal to. You lived knowing you'd probably die as property, that your entire existence was meant to serve someone else's comfort and profit. But now there was news of 70 gladiators who'd beaten a Roman force. Suddenly, the impossible seemed possible. If trained fighters could defeat Roman militia, maybe other slaves could fight back too. If escape from a heavily guarded ludus was possible, maybe escape from a farm or estate was possible. If freedom could be seized, even temporarily, maybe it was worth the risk. Slaves started running. They fled from farms in the dead of night, taking whatever they could carry. They escaped from estates while their masters slept. They walked away from work gangs when overseers weren't watching. They came in small groups and large groups, individuals and families, and they all headed for the growing camp of rebels who'd proven that Rome could bleed. Within weeks, that band of 70 had swelled into thousands. Within months, it was tens of thousands, people from all over southern Italy, from different tribes and different backgrounds, Gauls who'd been captured in Rome's conquest of their homeland, Thracians like Spartacus, warriors turned into property, Germans, Scythians, Greeks, Africans, people who spoke different languages, who'd been enemies in their homelands, who had nothing in common except their chains and their rage. And Spartacus welded them into an army. That's the transformation that should blow your mind. He didn't just lead a rebellion, he created a military organization from scratch, using people who had no reason to trust each other, no shared culture, no common language in many cases. He gave them structure, he gave them discipline, he gave them training. He turned farmers and household servants and field workers into soldiers who could face Roman legions and win. How do you do that? How do you take 10,000 people, then 20,000, then 50,000, people who've never held a weapon, who've never marched in formation, who don't speak the same language, and turn them into a fighting force? You use the only model you know, the Roman military system. Siege. Spartacus organized his army along Roman lines because that's what he'd learned in the legions. He divided his forces into units of roughly 100 men, similar to Roman centuries. He appointed leaders for each unit, choosing men who showed natural authority or who had military experience from before their enslavement. He established a chain of command so orders could flow from him through subordinate commanders down to individual fighters. He drilled them constantly. Every day, when they weren't marching or fighting, they trained. Basic formations first. How to stand in line, how to move together, how to maintain spacing so you could use your weapons without hitting the person next to you. It sounds simple, but coordinated movement is the foundation of military effectiveness. A mob charges forward in chaos and gets slaughtered. A formation advances with discipline and becomes a wall of shields and spears that's hard to break. He taught them to use captured Roman equipment. Most of his fighters had never held a gladius, the short sword that Roman legionaries used with devastating efficiency. So they practiced the basic strikes: thrust forward, withdraw, thrust again, stab, don't, slash. The gladius was designed for close-quarters killing, for punching through gaps in an enemy's defense. You didn't need fancy technique. You needed the discipline to stay in formation and the courage to keep stabbing when the person in front of you was trying to kill you. He taught them shield work. The scutum, Rome's large rectangular shield, was both defensive tool and offensive weapon. You could block with it, sure, but you could also bash with it using the metal boss in the center to strike an enemy's face or chest. You could lock shields with the fighters beside you, creating an overlapping wall that arrows and javelins bounced off. The shield wall was Rome's signature tactic, and Spartacus taught his army to use it against Roman forces. He established supply systems. An army needs food, water, weapons, medical care. You can't just wander the countryside hoping to find what you need, so Spartacus organized foraging parties that raided estates and towns for supplies. He set up workshops where captured smiths repaired weapons and armor. He designated medics who treated the wounded using whatever knowledge they had. He created the infrastructure that kept tens of thousands of people fed, equipped, and functional. And he maintained discipline. This is crucial. A mob is easy to scatter. An army requires soldiers who follow orders even when they're scared, even when the fighting gets desperate. Spartacus couldn't rely on Roman military law, on the brutal punishments that kept legionaries in line. His fighters were volunteers, people who'd chosen to join the rebellion. But he still needed discipline, so he created it through respect and shared purpose. You fought beside people you trusted. You followed leaders who'd proven themselves in battle. You stayed in formation because breaking formation meant your comrades died. The Senate finally realized this was serious and sent Praetor Publius Varinius with actual legionary forces. Varinius was a real commander with real troops, professional soldiers who'd trained for years, who'd fought in Rome's wars of conquest. He expected to crush this slave rabble quickly. He had the numbers, the equipment, the training, the experience. What could escaped slaves do against Roman legions? Spartacus showed him. In open battle, using the tactics he'd learned from Rome and adapted to his army's strengths, he defeated Varinius's forces. The ancient sources don't give us detailed battle accounts, but we know the outcome. 2,000 of Varinius's soldiers died. The rest broke and ran. Then Spartacus pursued and destroyed the force of Varinius's adjutant, Lucius Cicinius, who'd been sent with reinforcements. According to some accounts, Spartacus even captured Varinius himself and forced him to order his remaining troops to surrender. Let that sink in. A former slave, a former gladiator, had captured a Roman praetor. The man who'd been considered property had taken a Roman official prisoner. The psychological impact of that victory rippled through both the slave population and the Roman elite. For the slaves, it was proof that Rome could bleed, that the masters who'd seemed invincible were just men who could be beaten. For the Romans, it was the first tremor of real fear. If a praetor could lose to slaves, if legions could be defeated by people who'd been property, what did that say about Roman superiority? What did it say about the entire system? News of the victories spread faster than Rome could suppress it. Every estate, every farm, every household with slaves heard the stories. Spartacus had beaten praetors. Spartacus commanded an army. Spartacus was winning, and more slaves ran. They left their masters and joined the rebellion, swelling the ranks with fresh fighters who brought local knowledge, supplies, connections to other slave populations. By 72 BCE, Spartacus commanded an army estimated at somewhere between 100,000 and 120,000 people. The numbers are staggering. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a riot. This was a mobile nation of former slaves moving through Italy, defeating every force Rome sent against them. They raided estates and towns, seizing supplies, freeing more slaves, growing stronger with every victory. Think about what it took to feed that many people. 100,000 people need thousands of pounds of grain every day. They need water sources, campsites large enough to hold them, routes that can accommodate their movement. Spartacus wasn't just winning battles. He was solving logistical problems that would challenge modern militaries. He was moving a population the size of a major city through hostile territory, keeping them fed and equipped and organized, all while fighting off Roman attacks. But here's where the story gets complicated, where the human dynamics of leadership start to matter. Spartacus wasn't the only leader. He'd escaped with other gladiators, including a Gaul named Crixus, who was just as fierce, just as skilled in combat. Crixus had his own followers, his own vision for what this rebellion should be, and Crixus wanted something different than Spartacus wanted. Crixus wanted to stay in Italy. He wanted to raid and plunder and make Rome pay for every indignity, every cruelty, every life destroyed by slavery. He wanted revenge, pure and burning. Every estate they burned, every Roman they killed, every moment of terror they inflicted on the masters was justice for years of suffering. Why should they run? Why should they leave when they were winning? Rome had taken everything from them. Now it was time to take everything from Rome. Spartacus wanted something else. He wanted to get his people out. He led the army north, toward the Alps, toward the mountain passes that would take them beyond Rome's reach. If they could cross into Gaul, if they could make it to the free territories beyond Roman control, they could actually survive. They could build lives. They could be free, not just in the moment of rebellion, but permanently. They could find land, establish communities, live without the constant threat of Roman retaliation. It was the difference between vengeance and survival, between making Rome hurt and making sure your people lived. Both were valid. Both made sense. But they were incompatible, and the tension between them grew as the army marched north through Italy. They reached the Alps in 72 BCE. They defeated the Roman armies blocking the mountain passes. The consul, Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, came at them with legions, and Spartacus beat him. The consul, Lucius Gellius Publicola, attacked with more legions, and Spartacus beat him too. Two consuls, Rome's highest military commanders, defeated by an army of former slaves. The path to freedom was open. The Alpine passes lay ahead, leading to territories where Roman power was weak or non-existent. They could cross, they could escape, they could survive. And then Spartacus made a decision that historians still can't fully explain. He turned south. He led the army back into the heart of Italy, back toward the center of Roman power, back into the territory they'd just fought through. Why? We don't know for certain. The ancient sources offer hints, but no definitive answer. Some say his followers refused to leave. They'd tasted victory. They'd seen Romans flee before them. They'd raided estates and freed slaves and taken revenge for years of abuse. They wanted to keep fighting, keep winning, keep taking back what had been stolen from them. Maybe Spartacus couldn't convince them that survival mattered more than revenge. Maybe he tried to explain that crossing the Alps meant life, staying meant death, and they didn't listen. Maybe they were drunk on victory, unable to see that Rome would eventually marshal enough force to crush them. Or maybe Spartacus saw something we can't see from 2,000 years away. Maybe he believed they could actually win. Maybe he thought that with 100,000 fighters, with momentum on their side, with Rome's armies defeated and scattered, they could force a negotiated settlement. Maybe he hoped to spark uprisings in other parts of Italy, to create a crisis so severe that Rome would have to grant concessions. Maybe he thought they could establish a permanent territory in southern Italy, a place where former slaves could live free under their own governance. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he chose loyalty to his people over strategic wisdom. Maybe he saw that his followers wanted to stay and fight, and he decided that staying with them mattered more than being right. Leadership isn't just about making smart decisions. It's about maintaining the trust and cohesion of the people who follow you. If he'd forced them north against their will, if he'd split the army by insisting on his plan, he might have lost everything anyway. So maybe he chose to stay with them, to lead them in the direction they wanted to go, even if he knew it would probably end badly. We'll never know his reasoning. The ancient historians don't tell us what he was thinking, but we know what he did. He turned south, and the army followed him. The split with Crixus became final around this time. Crixus and a large portion of the army, maybe 30,000 fighters, separated from Spartacus's main force and went their own way. They wanted to stay in central Italy, raiding and fighting, taking revenge on every Roman they could find. Spartacus continued south with the larger portion of the army, apparently aiming for Sicily. Sicily made strategic sense. The island had seen major slave rebellions before, in 134 BCE and 104 BCE. There was a history of resistance, a culture of defiance among the enslaved population there. If Spartacus could get his army to Sicily, if he could spark a new uprising among the slaves working the massive grain estates that fed Rome, he could create a stronghold that Rome couldn't easily assault. An island fortress, defended by a massive army, supplied by the agricultural wealth of Sicily's farms. It could work. It was risky, but it could work. But first he had to get there. The Strait of Messina, the narrow channel separating southern Italy from Sicily, was only a few miles wide, but impossible to cross without ships. Spartacus didn't have a navy. He didn't have transport vessels. So he negotiated with Cilician pirates, traders, and raiders who operated throughout the Mediterranean. He offered them payment, probably gold and silver looted from the estates his army had raided, in exchange for transporting his forces across the strait. The pirates agreed. They took his payment, then they sailed away without carrying a single soldier. They betrayed him, either because Rome offered them a better deal or because they decided that getting involved in the slave rebellion was too risky. Whatever their reasoning, the result was the same. Spartacus was trapped in southern Italy with no way to reach Sicily, no way to escape, and Rome's full military might finally mobilized against him. Meanwhile, in central Italy, Crixus's luck had run out. Roman forces caught up with his 30,000 fighters and destroyed his army in battle. Crixus died fighting, and 2/3 of his followers died with him. The sources say 10,000 of Crixus's fighters were killed. The rest scattered or were captured. When Spartacus heard the news, he held funeral games in Crixus's honor, forcing captured Roman soldiers to fight as gladiators in mock combat. Think about the symbolism of that moment. For years, Crixus and Spartacus and thousands of others had been forced to fight and die for Roman entertainment. They'd been property performing for the amusement of free citizens who saw their deaths as spectacle. Now, Spartacus reversed it. He made Romans fight for the entertainment of former slaves. He turned the power dynamic upside down, even if only for a day, even if only symbolically. It was revenge and memorial combined, a way to honor Crixus while showing Rome what it felt like to be reduced to entertainment. But the funeral games couldn't change the strategic reality. Spartacus was trapped. The Senate had stopped underestimating the rebellion. They gave command to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome and a competent, ruthless general. Crassus understood that this wasn't just about defeating an army. This was about sending a message so brutal that no slave would ever dare to rebel again. The very foundation of Roman society depended on keeping slaves terrified and obedient. If Spartacus succeeded, if his rebellion inspired others, the entire economic system could collapse. So Crassus took command of 8 legions, tens of thousands of Rome's best soldiers, and he set out to end Spartacus once and for all. Crassus didn't make the mistakes earlier commanders had made. He didn't underestimate his enemy. He didn't assume that slaves couldn't fight. He treated Spartacus's army as a serious military threat and planned accordingly. He used conventional siege tactics, but he used them with overwhelming force and systematic brutality. He trapped Spartacus's army at the Isthmus of Bruttium, the narrow strip of land at the southern tip of Italy. Then he built a wall. Not a small fortification, but a massive barrier stretching across the entire isthmus, cutting off the rebels from their supplies, from any hope of breaking out to the north. The ancient sources describe a wall 37 miles long, 15 feet high, with a 15-foot deep ditch in front of it. It was a massive engineering project, built in weeks by thousands of legionaries working around the clock. Archaeologists have actually found remnants of that wall. It was real. Crassus literally walled off an entire region to contain the rebellion. He turned southern Italy into a prison, with Spartacus's army trapped inside, slowly running out of food and options. For a while, it worked. The rebels were under siege, cut off, slowly starving. Winter was coming. Food supplies dwindled. The army that had numbered over 100,000 was now desperate, trapped, facing the prospect of slow death by starvation or quick death, trying to break through Crassus's wall and the legions manning it. But Spartacus wasn't finished. In a desperate nighttime assault, his forces broke through part of the wall and the legion manning it. The sources don't give us details about how they did it. Maybe they filled in part of the ditch with earth and debris, creating a crossing point. Maybe they built crude ladders and climbed over in a mass assault. Maybe they found a weak point in the defenses and concentrated their attack there. However they did it, they broke through. They killed or scattered the legionaries guarding that section and poured through the gap, escaping the siege. They retreated toward the mountains near Petilia, trying to find defensible ground, trying to buy time. But time was the one thing they didn't have. Crassus's legions pursued them relentlessly. And Pompey, another famous Roman general, was returning to Italy with his legions after putting down a rebellion in Spain. If Pompey arrived, if those fresh legions joined Crassus, the rebellion would be crushed between 2 massive Roman armies. There would be no escape, no chance of survival. Spartacus had to act. He couldn't run anymore. He couldn't maneuver. He couldn't wait for a better opportunity because there wouldn't be one. So he chose to fight. Biol. In 71 BCE, somewhere near the Silarus River in southern Italy, Spartacus led his army into what he must have known would be the final battle. The ancient sources give us fragments of what happened. Plutarch says that Spartacus tried to reach Crassus himself during the fighting. He wanted to kill the Roman commander, to take down the man who'd orchestrated the rebellion's destruction. Maybe he thought that if he could kill Crassus, the Roman forces would break and scatter. Maybe he just wanted to die killing someone important, to go out making Rome pay for every life they'd taken. Whatever his reasoning, he fought his way toward where Crassus commanded, cutting through legionaries who tried to stop him. His horse was killed under him. Spartacus went down but got back up. Wounded, bleeding, he continued on foot, fighting his way forward. The sources say he killed 2 centurions, experienced officers who would have been skilled fighters themselves. But he couldn't reach Crassus. There were too many legionaries, too much distance, too much chaos. He was surrounded, wounded, exhausted from hours of fighting, and somewhere in that desperate final push, Spartacus fell. 3 ancient historians, Plutarch, Appian, and Florus, all say Spartacus died in that battle. But here's the haunting detail. His body was never found. After a battle where 6,000 rebels were captured, where the fighting was so intense that the ground was soaked with blood, no one could identify Spartacus's corpse. Maybe he was so disfigured by wounds that he was unrecognizable. Maybe his followers hid his body to prevent Rome from desecrating it, dragging it through the streets, or mounting his head on a spike. Or maybe, just maybe, he somehow survived and slipped away into legend. We'll never know. But we do know what happened to the 6,000 captured survivors. Crassus crucified them, every single one. He lined them up along the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome, over 100 miles of crucified bodies. One every few dozen yards, dying slowly in agony, visible to everyone who traveled that road. Crucifixion was designed to maximize suffering. You were nailed or tied to a wooden cross and left to hang there. Death came slowly, over hours or days, from a combination of factors. Exposure to the elements, dehydration, exhaustion. The position of your body made it hard to breathe. You had to push up on your nailed feet to expand your lungs, which caused excruciating pain. Then you'd sag back down, which made breathing harder. You went through cycles of pushing up and sagging down until you didn't have the strength anymore, and then you suffocated. It took days for them all to die. Some lasted longer than others, hanging there as their bodies failed, as dehydration and exhaustion and pain finally ended them. The Appian Way became a gallery of torture, a message written in human suffering that said, this is what happens when slaves forget their place. That's how terrified Rome was. That's how deeply Spartacus had shaken the Republic. They didn't just execute the survivors. They turned Rome's most important road into a monument to brutality, a warning that would be visible for weeks as the bodies rotted on their crosses. Every traveler on that road, every merchant and soldier and citizen would see what happened to people who rebelled against Rome. But here's what Rome couldn't kill: the memory, the story, the proof that it was possible. Spartacus had taken kitchen knives and turned them into a revolution. He'd taken people from different tribes, different languages, different cultures, and forged them into an army that defeated Roman legions. For 2 years, he'd made Rome take slaves seriously as military threats. He'd forced the Republic to commit massive resources, multiple armies, their best generals, to put down a rebellion of people they'd considered less than human. Think about the stories that spread after the war ended. Stories told in whispers by slaves still in chains. Stories about the Thracian who'd beaten praetors and consuls. Stories about men who'd been property, standing in formation, fighting like legionaries, winning battles against the greatest military power in the ancient world. Those stories didn't die with the men on the Appian Way. They lived in the minds of everyone who'd ever been told they were lesser, they were property, they had no power. And here's something the ancient sources tell us that should make you think. Sallust, a Roman historian writing about an enemy of Rome, called Spartacus a leader possessed with great strength and courage. Plutarch, another Roman writing for Roman audiences about a man who'd nearly brought down the Republic, called him a wise leader. These were Romans, members of the society Spartacus had fought against, writing about a slave who'd rebelled against everything Rome stood for. And even they couldn't deny his qualities. Even they had to admit that this man, this property, had demonstrated leadership that rivaled Rome's own commanders. That's the transformation that matters most. Not slave to general, though that's remarkable enough. It's the transformation from being considered subhuman to forcing your enemies to acknowledge your humanity through your actions. It's the transformation from being a tool, a weapon wielded by others, to becoming your own weapon, wielded for your own purposes. Remember that question I asked at the beginning? How did Spartacus unite 100,000 people from different backgrounds into a coordinated force? Here's the answer, and it's not what you might expect. It wasn't charisma alone, though he clearly had that. It wasn't just tactical brilliance, though he demonstrated that repeatedly. It was something deeper. He gave people who'd been treated as objects a chance to be subjects of their own story. He gave them agency. He gave them the possibility of dignity. Every slave in that army knew they might die. They knew the odds were against them. But Spartacus offered them something more valuable than safety, the chance to choose. Choose to fight rather than submit. Choose to risk death as a warrior rather than accept life as property. Choose to stand with others like them and face down an empire together. That's leadership, not commanding people to follow you, but giving them a reason to follow that speaks to their deepest needs. Spartacus understood that people who'd been stripped of everything still had one thing left, the ability to choose how they'd face their fate. And tens of thousands chose to follow him, knowing it would probably end in death, because fighting beside him meant more than surviving in chains. The Roman historian Appian estimated that about 100,000 people died in the Third Servile War. Most of them were slaves and former slaves. The crucifixions along the Appian Way were just the final, visible brutality. Thousands more died in battles throughout the 2-year campaign. But those deaths had meaning because those people had chosen their path. They'd rejected the role forced on them. They'd claimed their own agency, even if only for a brief, violent moment in history. And Rome never forgot. For years after, Roman forces hunted down scattered remnants of the rebel army, small bands still hiding in the countryside. The paranoia lasted for decades. Every slave rebellion, every minor uprising was met with overwhelming, brutal force because Rome remembered what happened when they underestimated enslaved people. Spartacus had taught them that lesson in blood, and they learned it well. But here's what I want you to understand about Spartacus's real legacy. It's not about whether he won or lost the war. He lost. Rome crushed the rebellion, killed or recaptured nearly everyone involved, and continued the slave system for centuries afterward. In that sense, he failed completely. But he succeeded at something more important. He proved that the categories Rome used to define people, slave and free, Roman and barbarian, human and property, those categories were lies. A slave could lead armies. A gladiator could defeat generals. People Rome had designated as subhuman could organize, strategize, and fight with skill that matched or exceeded Rome's vaunted legions. The system of oppression that Rome had built, the careful hierarchy that placed Romans at the top and slaves at the bottom, Spartacus shattered that illusion. He forced Rome to see that the only thing separating a slave from a general was opportunity and choice, not some inherent difference in capability or worth. That's why his story survived. That's why, 2,000 years later, we're still talking about a Thracian gladiator who died in a field in southern Italy, because he represents something universal. He represents the truth that systems of oppression contain the seeds of their own destruction. They have to teach the oppressed to function within the system, to do the work, to understand the mechanisms, and that knowledge can be weaponized. That understanding can be turned against the oppressor. Rome trained Spartacus to fight. They taught him formations, tactics, strategy. They thought they were creating a tool for their entertainment. Instead, they created someone who understood their military system intimately and used that understanding to defeat them. Every drill, every practice session, every forced combat in the arena was education. And when he had the chance, he used that education for liberation. Think about what that means for any system of oppression. The oppressor must teach the oppressed something about how the system works. A plantation owner must teach enslaved people how to farm, how to manage crops, how to organize labor. A factory owner must teach workers how the machines operate, how production flows, how the business functions. A colonizer must teach the colonized something about administration, governance, military organization. And all of that knowledge, intended to make exploitation more efficient, can become the foundation for resistance. Spartacus proved that martial skill, tactical thinking, strategic planning, these aren't qualities that belong to any particular class or status. They're human capabilities that emerge when people have the opportunity to develop them. Rome wanted to believe that Romans were naturally superior warriors, naturally better leaders, naturally more capable. Spartacus showed them that a Thracian slave could master everything they'd mastered and use it against them. That's the transformation that echoes through history, not just his personal journey, but what his journey revealed about everyone else in chains. If one man could go from being considered property to commanding 100,000 warriors, what did that say about human potential in general? What did it say about all the people Rome had enslaved, all the potential they'd buried under the weight of oppression? The answer terrified Rome. It should inspire you, because it means that the limitations placed on people by systems of power are artificial. They're maintained by force, by law, by custom, by the constant repetition of lies about who deserves what and why. But they're not real in any fundamental sense. They're not reflections of natural law or human nature. They're just arrangements of power, and arrangements can be changed. Spartacus changed the arrangement for 2 years. He created a space where former slaves could be warriors, where gladiators could be generals, where people who'd been property could make their own decisions about their lives. That space was temporary. Rome destroyed it. But the fact that it existed at all, the fact that it was possible, that knowledge couldn't be destroyed, it survived in the stories, in the memories, in the historical record that even Roman historians couldn't completely distort. And it survived in the inspiration it gave to later generations. Throughout history, people fighting against oppression have looked back to Spartacus, not because he won, but because he fought, not because he escaped slavery, but because he refused to accept it. His name became a symbol, a shorthand for resistance, for the refusal to submit, for the choice to fight against impossible odds because the alternative is spiritual death. Here's what I want you to take from Spartacus's story. Not that rebellion always succeeds. It doesn't. Not that fighting against overwhelming odds guarantees victory. It doesn't. What his story teaches is that the choice to resist, the decision to claim your own agency, even in the face of almost certain defeat, that choice has value in itself. It changes you from an object that things happen to into a subject who makes things happen. And that transformation, from object to subject, from property to person, from weapon to warrior, that's the transformation that can never be taken away. Spartacus died, probably at the Silarus River, probably trying to reach Crassus, probably knowing he'd lost the war. But he died as himself. He died as a free man, not in legal status, but in the only way that really matters. Free in his own mind, making his own choices, fighting for his own reasons. Rome could kill him, but they couldn't make him a slave again. They could crucify 6,000 of his followers, but they couldn't erase the fact that those people had chosen to fight rather than submit. That's the real victory. Not military, not political, but existential. The victory of maintaining your humanity in a system designed to strip it away. The victory of choosing dignity over safety, meaning over survival, resistance over acceptance. Those 6,000 men and women on the Appian Way died horribly, but they died free in the way that matters. They'd made their choice. They'd stood with Spartacus. They'd fought for something larger than themselves. And no amount of Roman brutality could take that choice away from them. So when you look at your own life, at the systems that constrain you, at the forces that tell you who you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to accept, remember Spartacus. Remember that the knowledge those systems must teach you to function within them can become the knowledge you use to challenge them. Remember that the limitations placed on you are artificial, maintained by power, but not justified by nature. Remember that choosing to resist, even when the odds are overwhelming, even when the outcome seems predetermined, that choice has value. You might not be facing literal slavery. You might not be leading a rebellion against an empire, but you're facing systems that want to define you, limit you, tell you what's possible for someone like you. And Spartacus's story says those definitions are lies. Those limitations are artificial. What's possible for you is determined by your choices, your actions, your willingness to learn from the system and then use that knowledge for your own purposes. The transformation from enslaved gladiator to military commander wasn't magic. It was observation, learning, courage, and the refusal to accept the role forced on him. Those are capabilities you have. Those are choices you can make. The question isn't whether you have what Spartacus had. The question is whether you'll use it. What role have you been assigned that you're ready to refuse? What knowledge do you have that could be weaponized for your own liberation? What impossible thing are you going to prove is possible? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me about the systems you're learning to challenge, the limitations you're refusing to accept, the transformations you're working toward. Because Spartacus's story isn't just history, it's a mirror. And what you see in that mirror, what you choose to do with what you see, that's where the real story begins.